Good afternoon. Okay, right. I'm really excited. In fact, I'm excited about everything, but the person we've got on next is just such an inspiration, such a support, such an incredible guy. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Derek. I'm going to let Derek say hey, and we're going to jump straight into a conversation together. This is Rethinking Philanthropy, right? I am pretty sure that all 100 plus of you in this call already have got so much to ask, and that's what we want, right? We want to have these conversations. Ask the stuff that you don't feel like you can ever ask a funder. Ask the stuff that you feel is like too awkward or you're not sure, because I promise you, Derek can really speak to it, and we can talk about it. He's been probably the single biggest support to me over the years in trying to figure out how to deal with so much. So this is Derek Bardowell. Derek, give everyone a wave. And I'm going to introduce the session, introduce Derek, and then we're going to get going. So we're going to have a conversation about rethinking philanthropy. We'll probably veer into all sorts of other things because Derek is a writer. He's a philanthropic advisor. He sits on the board of trustees of different funders. He once was a head of UK portfolio at a huge national funding body in the UK. He's been director of programs at Stephen Lawrence Trust. He's done so much incredible stuff, right? So, we'll veer into all sorts of directions. Derek's also got an amazing book out. And Derek talks a lot about sport and race too, which is like, sport is just a nice, beautiful hobby of mine. So we might just veer off into old friends over a cup of tea, having a conversation. So Derek talks about in the sort of blurb for this talk, it's not hard to map the neo-colonial DNA across the philanthropic sector, the effect of concentrating power, hyper-professionalising in a way that creates exclusivity, co-opting existing culture, forcing assimilation, leveraging local populations to obtain resources, and reinforcing larger systems of oppression. Derek asks, do we need to before we So do we need to perhaps dismantle before we reimagine? And reimagining philanthropy to tackle racism, a journey towards reconciliation, reparations, reimagination, and dancehall music. So we're gonna talk lots about this. I want you to get your questions in for Derek, and I'm going to kick off by asking Derek, speak to this the neo-colonial DNA that you talk about across the sector. Some of the things I talked about, the blurb talks about. I really want to talk to you about this because I do feel that, like, even work like ours, as soon as it starts to interact with the system, ends up having to make all these strange compromises and paradoxes, and gets you into all sorts of positions that you never intended to start with, and that creates distance, and the system reinforces that oppression. And then, fractures communities who are then in competition with each other instead of working together. So I really I'm going to go through step by step some of the things that you mentioned. But let's get started with your thinking behind this conversation, and what do you mean by the neo-colonial DNA across the philanthropic sector?
Thanks, Immy. And first, that's not my quote. Is a quote that I picked up, I think, from Stanford Innovation Review. But it's one of those quotes that I just wish I had said, ultimately, because it does wrap up a lot of the issues that we have in terms of philanthropy, in terms of really making good decisions on people's ideas. So if you look at the DNA of philanthropy, which is, very much part of the institution and very much reinforces, many of the things that we would look at in our society as being problematic. So it promotes, competition over collaboration. It promotes, individualism over community. How often will you see that because someone happens to be a very charismatic person, then suddenly they end up, charismatic and white, and they end up getting lots of money as a result of that. And but what people forget is, or don't see, is what the community lies behind it. So you look at all of these quite toxic things that exist in our society, and then you look at how this undemocratic thing that we call funding, that we call private foundations, where there's very little self-regulation and very little, you're at the whims of privilege, essentially, pushes and pulls any idea that comes into it into a very narrow lens. And that narrow lens is not reflective of the communities that are developing these ideas. So, part of me is, and let me put my hands up and say, being a part of that for the last decade, I'm completely complicit. I've existed within this world of narrow lens, gaming it and trying to, redesign, restructure things that fundamentally needs to be dismantled, rethought and done differently, because it doesn't really benefit those who are closest to the social issues getting the level of resource, support or understanding and empathy that's required for them to get change. Or if they do get money, they're getting money 3 or 4 or 5 years down the line, or they're getting money having to play some games that wasn't created for them to really win.
That's really interesting you talk about playing some games, because I think I'm going to get straight into this so we can so the questions can keep rolling in, because so it's really interesting, I think, as a personal experience, which is what kind of bonds us. We didn't know each other through all of your roles over the last 10 years. We sort of connected more just personally over work, and I'm just interested in this because I remember when I first met you talking about how hard it was to make a case for the work and get the resource to do it properly. Then when we got closer to going, okay, this is what I think I'm gonna apply for, and you were like, what, per year? And I was like, no, for the whole time. And you were like, no, you need to be applying for this per year, right? And I remember the confidence that you kind of gave me to be a bit bolder with that. But then at the same time, it's that quote, isn't it? You're never gonna change a system by having to play by the master's like tools, right? You're never gonna. That's not where we're gonna reimagine or dismantle. And so then you have to play this game with the sector, and you end up going into that system and having to make some sacrifices, having to make decisions, which then could be, not at all where your community is or the work that you wanted to do. And you have to sort of play that game of the charisma and the things that need to happen with this idea that you need to get the resource into your community. And then you've got this complete different side to what we have also talked about, which is just dismantling, completely moving outside of those systems, completely dismantling and moving those endowments into much more equitable, reparative trajectories. Talk to me a bit about this, right? Because you've not in age, but in wisdom and in work. I see you as an elder. What do you think about this play that communities of colour, Black and Brown, POC communities are having to play to get the resource that was resource often extracted from their own their histories and homelands to do the work, which then is again pitting us all against each other. And I've seen this play out over and over again, and I'm sure you have. But can you speak about that a little bit?
I mean, could you imagine turning down Martin Luther King because he didn't have a theory of change? Could you imagine, all of these great leaders who have affected social change in a way that is unbelievably profound and grounding, failing because they didn't write a 40-page application form correctly? To me, it's the most ridiculous notion. Can you imagine a conversation? I've had this conversation before where people have questioned, because something is uplifting a particular community, that it doesn't have a community cohesion agenda to it, that it's not valid or it's segregationalist. To me, these are really ridiculous conversations. Anyone that studied the civil rights movement will know that the civil rights movement didn't just benefit Black people, it benefited everyone, and everyone's liberation is linked to each other. So there was an issue and continues to be an issue in terms of Black liberation, but the impact of that on other movements, on other communities, on other marginalized communities was absolutely huge. Yet you were talking about a system that is, in terms of philanthropy, that is already knocking out ideas because the people behind who are making the decisions have no conception of those ideas. They've not got any lived experience of those ideas. They don't understand where it comes from. So they are making decisions based on their narrow lens, and also the bureaucracy that creates a level of, and I don't know why there is this level of bureaucracy, because so much of the decision making ends up being subjective anyway. And most of it, ends up being people's value judgments anyway. But you have this bureaucracy that's created to say yes and no. And for me, again, it's wholly problematic, because ultimately, if you look at what's happened now with George Floyd, with Black Lives Matter, and the issue around how work that's led by Black and brown people are funded, suddenly there is a massive interest in it now because it's hit the headlines. But this isn't something that, the Black community and brown community have been talking about this for years in terms of underinvestment. And now that our pain is splattered on in front of the newspapers, people now want to make a change. And even then, people making a change, none of this has really resulted in any major actions. I haven't seen anyone make a bold or courageous step in terms of how they're investing into Black and brown communities. It's just lots of, if I'm being frank, people asking me to send lists and lists and things of that nature. And I know it's not just me, because I know that plenty of other people have done that. So, there has to be this acceptance on this, that the system is not correct, that you need to take a hard, long look in the mirror about your systems, processes, who you're decision making, who's making the decisions, and make a bold step to do one of two things. One, to just fundamentally change, because ultimately, if this is a sector that talks a lot about data and evidence, well, we've got lots of data and evidence about who are being disproportionately impacted on police brutality, COVID-19, poverty, housing, everything. So if your data and evidence is true, then your investments need to be leading that way. And if they're not, then your data and evidence agenda actually is just false. And also, if you're not acting on this, then you can't say that you are independent or you're independent of government and whatever, because ultimately we've known from all of the reports that have come out for the last 3 or 4 years and historically about lack of diversity, about lack of investment into Black and brown organizations. We know all of that. People are starting to talk about it now, years down the line, because of what's happened with George Floyd. But ultimately, that inertia, that inaction is a political act in itself. You cannot turn around and say, we are independent, we are not political or whatever. The fact that you have ignored this for so many years, the fact that the level of investment into Black and brown communities and Black and brown led social change has been so poor historically, despite data, despite evidence, despite everything that came out with the Race Disparity Unit back in 2017. That's a political decision that you're making, and that's conscious. That's conscious to ignore that. So for me, it's like I get really energized by younger people because they've just had enough. They've really had enough of this. They've really, and going back to the conversation you and I had, the reason why I just said, just be bold in terms of the ask is because you're bold in your vision. you're bold, your community are bold. Why jump through hoops to try and get money when ultimately you can come in with a suit and tie and try and do, and trust me, I've done that. I've done the whole integration listing, you know, and probably damage my self-esteem in ways you couldn't imagine by doing that. You know, I've tried to do other thing where it's like, oh, maybe I just play up a little bit to being a bit more street than I really am, you know, to try and influence in that way. You try different methods to do this and you realize that actually it's all the same. And actually all that you've got at the end of the day is your self-worth, your self-esteem, and whether you can look in the mirror at the end of the day in the way that you've acted in terms of trying to, you know, represent your communities and do your work. So I just felt that when we had that conversation, I remember that conversation in a Malaysian cafe, I think it was. I remember, you know, just thinking to myself, do you know what? You can't be doing the self-questioning because, you know, ultimately, if you'd gone in one way, you know, I don't know whether, you know, that would have been any more effective than going in another way, because there's already a kind of judgment about who and what you are. There's already a ownership of Immy, you know, in terms of, I'm going to be her champion. I'm going to be, you know, I'm linked to her. You know, I'm credible in different communities because I'm linked to, you know, which happens to all of us. You know, we know that, you know, that happens to us. But with all of that, I don't know whether it makes a fundamental difference how you go in, because ultimately, I'm sure there's plenty of people that have said, oh my God, Derek's become a bit gobby since he's left, you know, the funding sector. And it's like, well, no, this is who I am. But perhaps it just wasn't a safe space for me to be me in that particular space. And if that's the case, then that isn't just on me. That is also on you. And if I can sit back and say, yo, I can question some of my behaviors over the last few years. If you can't do the same, then there's no place to start. And that's the starting point. People have to have that conversation. They have to be able to look in the mirror around some of this stuff.
Derek, thank you for that, because I think one of the things that, you know, that there's a bunch of stuff that I'm going to move on to, but one of the things you speak to there is this idea that, you know, we're conditioned to try all these different ways. I'm going to be like more like this, right? Or I'm going to be a bit more like this, or I'll try this, or I'll try that. And it gets us kind of back to square one, which is when there's a systemic lack of value in the work and the opinions and the data and the research. You know, it doesn't matter which way you present yourself, it's never going to be the right way. There'll always be another reason why you weren't, you know, correct enough for that thing. And Laura's put a comment in the chat which says bureaucracy to hide the subjective nature of funding. And I think that's so true, because after speaking to you, I realized that this was like so many different reasons why people would be like, no, it's not enough of this, or it's not enough of that, or it's too much of this, or Immy's too much that, or, and I hear it about so many other people. And I feel like you saw straight through my soul for a second there, because you're absolutely right. It's not just about me, but this is obviously a conversation between me and you. Like the ownership over like, I did this, or I was the savior that helped this, and how you become beholden to people is really tough. And you know what? The other thing is, it's really important, like when you talk about being complicit in this, I know how much that, if that's what you're surrounded by all the time, and if that's what you're conditioned to and having to jump through, it's really important and hard. And there's moments where I make mistakes because you become that, right? You embody that, and you're having to constantly play that game to get the resource to do the work, and then unlearn that game in order to not recreate that with your community. And I just feel like you know what, there's so much of this that's a game that all of that, you have to do all of that all the time, every day, in every conversation before you even get on with the work. And the work is really hard, right? And so what I want to just reflect on that, because I want to come back to you on that point. Like when there is just a fundamental 400,000-500,000, well, not 1,000, but 400 or 500 year head start on systems and processes, do you find that even when Black and brown people start to organize and start to build their own structures, there's just a systemic lack of trust and over-regulation, and kind of like there's no room for mistakes, even though those endowments and those systems have had hundreds of years to evolve and endless resource to grow. You know, I've definitely noticed some of this in some of the resourcing racial justice work we've been doing, is like the level of scrutiny is just like nowhere near the same. And the level of understanding that we're only just being able to grab a tiny little minuscule percentage of the resource that has been extracted from our lands, our ancestors, our communities. And I just feel like, you know, setting you up to fail is also part of that game. And I'm interested in what you think about that.
Well, that's part of the reimagination of it, because the concept that we have is at the moment is giving, and it's not about giving, it's about redistributing. You know, it's about how those resources have been extracted from Black and brown communities, from indigenous communities traditionally, and how do you give back? So if you look at it this way, and this is crude, and this is, you know, needs greater scrutiny, but, you know, ultimately, if in terms of independent trusts and foundations, they give away, I don't know, £3.5 billion per year in the UK. And there is, what, 13% of people that are classified as Black and minority ethnic in this country, then that equates to 400 million pounds, okay? Is 400 million pounds fundamentally going into Black and brown led social change, you know, or charities or work? You know, we're talking about an BME infrastructure that's suffering. And actually, in terms of proportionality, in terms of the amount of money, it's nowhere near the amount of money that goes into it. And I know there's many rules and games that says, just because you're Black and brown, it doesn't mean that you're delivering great services or great money. But I'm talking about the disparity between how much those organizations are getting and the conditions through which they're getting that money. It's not even close to the amount of money that's being distributed on our behalf. So there's that issue. The second issue is that ultimately, if you're looking at the DNA of Britain, that looks upon Black and brown people in a particular way, it means that the lens of the institutions is all often very negative, you know. So if you are if I go back to my school experiences, then the view of a teacher of me at that particular, when I was a kid, was very much low expectations, you know. So I have low expectations at school, and that's how they viewed me when I went to school. Then I'd leave school and go into a shop, and I'd get stopped and searched by the police. Was that racialized? Well, of course it was, because my best mate was white. We'd go into the shop together, but I'd be the only person that would get stopped and searched when I'd come out of the shop. So I'm seen by the police as a threat, okay? And then I go into the charity sector, and the charity sector views Black and brown people as beneficiaries. So if that's your lens, okay, and regardless of what the language is and regardless of what the tone is, but if that is fundamentally the view and the lens of us, that means that the way we are viewed is through our pain. It's through being disadvantaged, and being that the DNA of this country is very much around self-interest. It's very much around, it's your fault. It's the individual's fault. It's not the system or the structure's fault. It essentially puts the blame on us as individuals through the lens of us being beneficiaries, as opposed to us being leaders or whatever the case may be. So that conception of giving needs to change, because what comes with that are all of these stereotypes, this eugenic thinking, racism, everything, all of those things come wrapped up in this concept of giving and who deserves to get and who's worthy of getting, you know. So that needs to be reimagined. But at the same time, and this is where I come back to, do we need to dis before we can re, is that it's clear that it needs to be dismantled. But that's going to take time. It's going to take years, and it's going to take, you know, really bold, courageous leadership from those that have the power to be able to take that first step towards reconciliation. But while that's happening, we can't be sitting here waiting for you to work it out 50, 30, 70, 80, 90 years down the line. There needs to be a system or a way in which that investment is going into our communities, but not through the lens of us as beneficiaries, and not through the lens of our pain, but through the lens of our visions, and through the lens of the way in which that type of either support or investment early, even if you don't get it, even if you don't understand it. And I've got to say this, some of the best things that I've funded have been things where fundamentally I didn't fully understand all of it. But that was the whole point, is that actually my mindset was probably too narrow to understand it. And I'm talking to someone that's thinking 7, 8, 9, 10 years ahead of me in that. And actually, I have to trust in that. And I have to trust in what that vision is. So that's not me saying you pull away money for instant interventions and stuff like that. What I am saying is that if you're funding 90% or 99% of your work in stuff that ultimately is filling these gaps that have been left behind by the state, and you're doing so with literally 0.5% of the resources that the state has to do it, then it's like a sticky plaster that's not waterproof and only covers up, 1% of the wound. You're always going to be fighting. Is that a good use of money? Or is a good use of money actually putting money into things that's potentially catalyzing change within those structures and within those systems that alters the 99.5% that is the root cause of that wound in the first place? And I think that's what I always come back to, is that the balance between what is funded, which I'm not saying, there's perfectly good stuff that is funded, but I'm saying in terms of investment in Black and Brown vision, investment in, structural changes, investment into ideas that fundamentally reimagines everything from our policing, border controls. And when I say policing, I'm not just talking about the police here. I'm talking about how, all public state people and employees have moved towards being part of the police, be it, through the prevent agenda or through, teachers or whatever it might be. But fundamentally reimagining that and our prison systems and all of these things that can make us potentially a better society. And when I say a better society, I mean in terms of our relationships and understanding of each other. There's got to be more investment into that. And I have to say, on top of that, and this is where I come back to it, where so much of that energy is coming from young people, because they've turned around and said, enough is enough. They've turned around and said, God, being polite really isn't getting, how far has that got you? And youngers have said that to me, and said, wow, but how much progression have you made? And I've turned around and said, boy, actually, I don't know. It's felt like lots of graft and it's felt like lots of emotional labor, but I'm not sure whether fundamentally anything has really changed. So, for me, I give thanks to, people like yourself, to Fazana Khan, to Amara Spence, to Ruth Ibagabuna, to my colleagues that are in Future Foundations UK. I'm going to shout them out because those people are the ones that are providing so much energy to say, yo, Derek, you really need to question what you've done there and look at a better way. And you know, that for me feels like a good progression. But as I said, we, as in Black and brown people, in our relationship with this country has evolved so much. And I speak about this in my book, that when I look at my dad, who was Jamaican, who came over here as a young'un, raised me, you know, so my dad's a Jamaican man. I am a political Black man. That's how I classify myself, to my son, who is, you know, an England fan through and through, you know, and he won't like me saying this, but, you know, when England got knocked out in the semi-finals of the World Cup, you know, he was bawling his eyes out and stuff. And I look at that evolution and I say, our relationship has really evolved in terms of our belonging to this country. But this country's evolution with us has stayed the same. It stayed the same because if you can still have an elected government with eugenic thinkers at the helm after so many years, creating policy that's still based on conceptions of inferiority and of inferiority and being superior, then that tells me that the way that our relationship as Black and brown people has evolved has been far deeper than what this country's relationship has evolved with us. And to me, that scares me. That absolutely scares me because, you know, there has been moments where I've felt really, really positive about that change. And that really hasn't been met with any level of action, sustained action from the state in terms of their relationship with us and to us.
Thanks, Derek. We could talk about so many examples from the latest Windrush deportations, the compensation to Grenfell, to how many numerous examples that we could talk about in the evolution argument. And we've got some great questions coming in, and Saz from the Civic Square team is going to join us shortly to start going through some of those questions. And yes, we're going to talk about some of those visions. We're going to talk about, you know, what does creating a space look like for that. So Jen and Edward and other people have asked questions. We're going to get to those shortly. I want to just pick up on one thing before we start talking a bit about the questions and what dismantling could look like. And you know, if anything you can't talk about, you can just say pass forward. Just give me a shout. It's absolutely fine. And before that, I want to just pick up on Derek's point about, you know, the long journey ahead of this, and investing in dreams and visions and futures and imaginations of particularly Black people. Don't forget that we have the link tree available on the front page of the festival that has curated 6 visionary leaders and communities who are reimagining and working on big, bold visions, from land justice to spaces for queer people of colour and queer young people of colour. So get in and share those. I definitely haven't seen you guys sharing those enough or investing in those enough those last few days, given that over the last week, over the last 2 days, we've had like 500 people in these talks. Get sharing those, okay? Because you're consuming all this content for free, and even if you can't invest, you can share it with people. And it might not seem to you, right, that this is like a small 30 or 50,000 crowdfunder can solve everything. Of course it can't, but we've got to start moving the money somewhere. Like, we can't just sit, like Derek says, and just wait for like a massive unraveling of endowments and all of that. We're going to fight for that, but, you know, like, get on with what you can do now. And also thanks so much to Laurie for putting in a racial equity grant making with a racial justice lens link in the chat, so that's amazing. So we're gonna have questions shortly, but I want to pick up on one thing, another paradox, Derek. So we've seen COVID-19 suddenly allow the kind of pouring of like a resource. Suddenly decisions that would take months to make can be made in weeks. Reporting can be changed. We can be more unrestricted and trust like that leaders and communities are going to use their money in the way that is correct for the situation. We've seen through the BLM uprising, the amount of ideas around knowledge production, around land reparation, land justice, all these things come to the fore, right? Like, and money's in one sense is suddenly like all the rules are changing and we can change. Mm-hmm. In the other sense, for example, and like you said, you can just say no comment if you need to on this one, because I don't know where we're at with it, but I know you made a public statement with others. Things like the National Emergency Trust, right? Like, you made a public statement about stepping down from that because you felt as if, or the collective who stepped down felt as if they were just justifying decisions that had already been made. Whole other conversation there about what it means for Black and brown people to sit on boards and just feel like they're propping up decisions that have already been made, because I've had those experiences. So it's definitely not the answer just to say we need more Black and brown people on our boards to everyone who's listening. That's like one tiny bit of the story. So like, talk to me about this, right? Because in one sense, all the rules are changing. In the other sense, nothing's changing. In one sense, all the signals are right about the comments people are making and what the foundations are saying they're going to do. In another sense, we're not seeing any bold dismantling of an endowment or, you know, a 10 or 50 or 100-year commitment of £1 billion from massive endowments or something like that, right? We're not seeing any of that. So what are you thinking about this, right? Like, what do we do to sustain the sudden breakdown of some of the bureaucracy that has held so many people back? But how do we make sure that it's not just, you know, a big PR strategy? And you can link to that if you want with, you were talking before, like young people saying like politeness has not got us anywhere. And like movements like Charity So White, which are now getting like criticisms for being too scary, or like, you know, they're calling everything out too much, and it's too this and it's too aggressive and it's too that. Like, what's going on in the sector right now? What do you think COVID is teaching us, or at least want us to think about before we move into like visions and you know, some more brilliant revolutionary dismantling imagination stuff?
I mean, first and foremost, you know, Charity So White, for example, are just a hugely collaborative collective of people in terms of the way they've opened up space like nothing that I've seen in recent times in terms of this particular conversation, you know, and you know, they work tirelessly and they work collaboratively in terms of trying to dismantle this stuff. So, you know, in the one sense, it's like you're having conversations with really well-meaning people. And this isn't me at all saying people are bad and bad-minded or anything. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that they are well-meaning within a context in terms of Black and brown people that they don't understand, you know, and you know that they don't understand it because the amount of conversations that I've had that have been just quite painful for me to have. And when I say painful for me to have, it's because we're talking about, I don't have power to change things in that way. I'm not in that position, or not in that position anymore. And you're having conversations and essentially saying, I know these people are doing good work. Here's another list, and here's the reasons why. And you're doing this continually. And you're doing it over and over again, and you don't know where any of those lists are going. You don't know how people are investing. The calls suddenly dry up afterwards because they've kind of got what you want. And what you've done is you've sat in the middle of something where you said, I have to take the call because I'm in a privileged position to be someone that they would want to speak to. But at the same time, I don't know whether anything has fundamentally shifted, because I don't know whether that person on the other end of the phone fundamentally understands. So for me, it's actually about creating an alternative structure or alternative economy, something that is Black and brown led. Look, anyone that's within the structure of a funder and foundation are often trying to advocate for work that they might be passionate about, but often the people that are making the decisions are unbelievably divorced from a lot of those social issues. So how wonderful would it be at one point in life where you're a grants manager or whatever that is, and when you're going to your board, the board looks like you. They reflect your experience, and you go in and you don't have to game it. You don't have to try and do extra work with an organization you're passionate with because you know what's going to be coming at the other end, because the people get it, and the bottom line is the distance between people doing the work and the people that are making the decisions is so vast. And for that to come together will take so long that ultimately the best thing that you could do is find an alternative mechanism, release some of your endowment, or collectively put your money together and create, not you create, as in the foundations, but allocate money that creates an alternative decision-making structure, so us as a community has a space, and has a community that enables us to innovate and create and work with you at the same time to help develop your structures. You do that, and then you create the type of space to do that. But we can't do that alone. And when I say do that alone, I mean that if you're an ally, then as an ally on a trustee board, you need to be talking to other trustees of other foundations and advocating for that level of space, resource, investment, and income to be created for us to do that. Because largely, we haven't had that same level of trust in our visions to be able to do that. So for me, you have to create as an alternative and give it the space and time to breathe, but also be advocates with us, to do that. And this isn't about displacement. This isn't about all of that. This is about being good. This is about being better. It's like if you have a teacher, and I remember someone did this experiment once where they put like cameras in a room of a teacher, and the teacher, I think when they were teaching, and she didn't realize this, but I think when pupils were putting their hands up, I think she was, always picking the boys instead of the girls, and she didn't realize this was going on. And when she looked at the tapes back, I think she was like completely mortified that this was happening. She didn't realize. But part of the process was not around being damning towards her as a teacher. It was about improving her teaching, and doing that by helping her realize what she was doing in terms of bias against girls in that classroom in the way that she was teaching. So for me, this is about improving and getting better. But as I said, coming back to the younger generation, the patience has shifted us 2 to 3%. It really hasn't shifted us significantly enough. And when you look at the boards and the structures and the SMTs, ways recruitment's done, when you look at the emotional violence that Black and brown people face within philanthropic structures and them not feeling safe in those particular structures, then you realize that the 2 or 3% is just not good enough, and something as an alternative needs to be created.
Oh, for sure. Thank you, Derek. I feel a bit heartbroken because I think so. This last 3 months, I think I've headed into a new generation where I've now been asked for the lists, which means that I'm no longer the person that I think I am, because people are asking me for the lists. And I'm like, yo, what's happening with these lists that are just like, you know, where's this graveyard of lists that we're just creating an endless list? So, oh man, you know, I feel like I've just been upgraded to a new age bracket, which is, I turned 35 in October, so I'm out of that 18 to 34. And maybe when you are just on the end of that, you start getting all this like stuff like, send me a list of great people we should fund, and then you never know if they've been funded or like what's happened, or whether like people have like done their heads in with process and all of that, and like just the disappointment of like not promising, but like saying to people, you know, maybe we can do this, and then they end up in these like long painful processes. So yeah, I feel like I just had a moment there where you just saw straight into my soul and knew I was the new list person, or one of the new generation of list people. So on that, I'm gonna invite Zaz on in a second, and we're gonna ask some questions, and we're gonna start talking about hope, visions, radical visions, smaller next steps. All of that is what I hope we can do for the last 15 or so minutes. But I just want to say that like one of the things that that I've been really lucky to be part of is this great group of people, led in a very democratic way, and she won't like me saying led by Fazana Khan, who's been starting to bring some of this vision into play about like decentralize the money, create an alternative space that can be like centers, black and brown leaders, and start that process, right? But the thing I put my finger up to here and say is that, you know, this is the start of those processes, and you know, funds like RRJ doesn't have like a massive endowment behind it where it can start planning for 50 or 100 years. It can start buying in the best design resource and setting up platforms and having a team. It's like people at the beginning of that journey of dismantling hundreds of years of extraction from their communities, the issues and trauma that comes with that, the healing that needs to happen, as well as the practical application. And then the other thing is that everyone's working in their own way in their communities as well. But on a practical note, there's a second wave of resourcing racial justice coming up next in the next couple of months. So keep following if you're here because you're looking for funding and investment. You know, we're just people trying our best to start moving that juggernaut in the right direction. You know, deep down, we want some dismantling of the endowments, and we want billions to be put aside and start to be a much more reparative lens to land, to wealth, to all of that. But this is a start. So yeah, I'm just going to have a moment to get over the fact that I'm now the list person. I'm going to invite Zaz back onto the call, and we've got some. Hey Zaz, feel free to introduce yourself to everyone. And yeah, we've got some great questions. So Zaz is going to take us through some of the questions, and yeah, and then if you've got any reflections too, Zaz, feel free to like start sharing them. And yeah, I'm gonna be quiet for a bit.
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Zaz. I'm part of the Civic Square team, and my pronouns are they and them. So Derek, I've got some questions for you. I'm going to start with one of my own, so it's a bit of a reflection. So you mentioned like narrow lenses, and I just kind of wanted to ask, I guess it's a question about kind of tools more than anything. How do we break through those conversations that kind of can sound a bit like, well, if this event or this thing is specifically for Black young people and not for anyone else, that's divisive? How do we kind of break through that narrative, and what kind of tools can you kind of offer us to be thinking about when in those situations?
Thanks, Daz. And that's a difficult one to answer. And I say that it's difficult is because me asking it as a Black male is very different from a Black or brown female asking it in that context. So there are certain things that I would probably be able to get away with being a man. There's probably certain things that I would be able to get away with given the senior levels that I've worked in. That means that the tools that I have for being able to do that and the response that I might get back wouldn't necessarily be as emotionally violent as it would if you're a Black woman within that particular context. So, you know, within my context, as I said, I've done so many different code switches over the years to try and get things done that, you know, I don't know if there is a singular tool to be able to do it. I just know that now is not the time to be holding back in terms of making that particular ask. And if anything has opened up now at this particular point in terms of not having to sugarcoat language around this, then I would just say, you know, you have to ask it. But I would also say that the response that you might get back, depending on how you are situated in terms of, you know, gender and race, could be quite hostile, and you need to have a safe space, a community of people that enables you to be supported in that journey to be able to do that. Sorry, that's not an adequate answer, but, you know, to some degree, I don't think that I'm fully placed to provide a completely broad view of it. But I do think this is a time to make that ask, but just to ensure that you have a community of people around you that can help you through that terrain.
No, I just want to speak to that a second as well, Zaz, in the sense that, like, I think what I've experienced a lot of is this very, like, reductionist, pitting everyone against each other. There's not enough to go round type mindset, right? Where, you know, any time that I've brought something up, well, not any time, sorry, that's a complete over exaggeration, but there has been times in senior situations where I'm around power brokers and people with resource, where I've mentioned, you know, spaces that are led by Black people, or particular spaces and work that needs to be created, and the snap back to be like, yeah, but what about the white working class, or what about, and this idea that actually there's only this small pot with not enough to go round, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to say, because you said that, we have to, like, say, what about this, right? And so I think it's this idea that, and I feel like that's where we, last night, Davita was talking about, where white supremacy damages us all, and where when we don't understand how our liberation is wrapped up in each other, we come with this idea that there's not enough to go around, right? And I'm fully here for the fact that philanthropy has 1% of what the state has, and it is just a small part of it. But there are billions in these endowments. This idea that you couldn't right now pledge $1 billion and go out of business maybe in 50 years before, you know, instead of 500 years, you were out of business in 450 years or something like that, is just ridiculous. Like, that small-minded, like, non-abundant, focusing on the pain rather than the visions gets us nowhere. So I don't know what the answer is, because once you're in and you're safe, and people are listening, they're then pitting you and your communities against each other for resource. But what I do know for sure is that allergic reaction is that, and if people are listening, right, by saying a certain type of work needs investing, it's not saying that something else isn't important, and pitting that against each other is dangerous and damaging for everyone. But yeah, like, look at the Abele statistics that show that when you do that over a long period of time, you destroy whole, like, communities and livelihoods. So I know it's, like, completely counterintuitive to a lot of people, but this idea that we don't have enough resource to go around, so anytime someone mentions something, we need to mention another oppressed group, is really part of that same line of, like, supremacist thinking, which is there to divide and say there's not enough to go around, as opposed to an abundant vision future where we can all thrive together. But yeah, anyway, I'm going to stop, because I'm going to literally go off on a rant right now. So do you want to ask some of the questions from the audience?
Yeah. Derek, thank you for that response as well. I think it's really important to acknowledge that there are different experiences, right, when it comes to different people saying these things, and whatever, like, your background is and things like that. I think it's really important to kind of have that honest answer, because it's true, right? It's going to be different if me, as, like, a queer, non-binary Black person goes into a space and says, hey, I want this, and maybe I don't have as the years of experience yet or things like that. So really thank you for that. So I'm going to go on to a question that's coming from the audience, and this is from Jen Hook. And Jen says, Immy and Derek, you both talk about creating space for underinvested leaders. From the point of view of the leader, what does this space look and feel like?
For me, so one, I do think there's a separation thing, because you have to be out of that system of standard philanthropy for that sort of ideas creation, decision making, and all of that sort of stuff. So resourcing racial justice, as an example, is a good example of there has been space that has been created for a community to collectively create a fund that is being distributed to, you know, Black and Brown led social change. That's a good example, because you're talking about the knowledge, the creation, everything is within that one. So I think that's one model. I think the other model is around, if you are investing in particular individuals, then those individuals being able to get that extra resource to be able to on-fund and support more communities or people within their communities as well. You know, so there is no reason why, in terms of an allocation of funding, if one particular organization, Black or Brown organization, has already created a collaborative space with all of the principles and all of the ethics that you would say is really good in terms of social change and everything, then resource that and let the money flow and be funded and distributed through that particular community, because it will be nurturing lots of other people and thinkers, but people and thinkers who will also have a positive mindset. So I think those are two things. And then I just always come back to this. It's also about humility. It's also about the people that are in power being humble enough to step away and to recognize conversations and spaces that they shouldn't be in, and be comfortable with the fact that we're in at this point, but no, at this point you shouldn't be in that, and you know, and all of that. So I think there's that humility bit. There is a bit about the alternative structure stroke economy to create those safe spaces, but I also think that bit around investment in particular communities to accelerate more investment into communities and people, I think would be three of the ways that I would go in terms of safe spaces.
Yeah, for sure. I'll answer that as Immy, as opposed to like being part of this conversation. So I think there's a bunch of steps, and for me, it has to be linked into a long-term vision of dismantling the endowment, and a commitment to publicly understanding where that endowment came from and what a reparative dismantling looks like, right? So if you got 10 billion and you commit in the next 10 years, you're going to completely unbundle 10 billion of that, $1 billion of that, and put it into whatever. I'm interested in that. I'm not a financier, so I'm not going to talk about the technicalities of that, but it has to be invested as part of a long-term piece. That then does the internal work to be honest with where the money came from, what if it is extractive, where your endowment is invested, where are you getting returns from, is there like unintentional or intentional harm being created by like where you're making profits from, for example, where that endowment is growing from. I also think like we just need to know how much endowments are growing each year. Like some endowments are growing 10 times bigger than the money that's going out. And it's like, I'm pretty sure that we're like, in fact, I'm near on convinced we're totally effing over the global south in order to grow our endowments. And then we're not like investing that much back in. I want that out there. Like that's not cool. Building on what, in fact, it's not just not cool. It's freaking unjust, right? I just mean, let's not go down that road right now, because we've got some more questions. Practically though, like as not practically, short term though, the trust piece is massive. Like the trusting, even if some of that goes wrong, allow room for failure. Like you've allowed room for failure for such a long time in so many other ways. Stop expecting that first time you give a measly like 5k, that it's going to be like, you know, there's going to be land reparations after 5k of investment. It doesn't work like that. So you've got to work from a place of trust, visions, and not pain. And the one that so invest in the visions, encourage the visions. Don't just encourage like pain and need and outcomes. Like encourage the vision. Tell me about your vision of what if everything turned out like we had that talk yesterday. What happens if things turned out amazing, right? What is it that you would be doing, and how can we fund that? Fund generously and in the long term, and make sure it's reparative. You know, if you don't think someone deserves £1 million, well, it doesn't really kind of matter what you think, right? Link that up to what reparation in that space looks like as well, because lots of people don't think that the endowments deserved loads of our ancestors' money either. But, you know, we ain't here burning your institutions down yet. And then the last one that I've learned really, really sharply these last 6 months, and from now on, I'm going to fight to the like absolute end of this until my dying days, is when you fund ecosystem work, i.e. say you fund me, you need to, I'm so busy trying to fight for the money for that ecosystem in an unjust, racist, like lack of trust system, that I'm having to become like you to get that. And then when I come back into my ecosystem and where I was built and who built me and how we built together, I'm now the one with resource when others who were there weren't. So from now on, I'm gonna really talk about the fact that interdependent ecosystem organizations, say you give me £1 million, I then want another 5 million to give 1 million to everyone or the 5 organizations that I was most interdependent with immediately, because that division you're creating amongst us is like deadly, right? And it's another function of the inequitable white supremacist model and colonial model of funding. That sounds hard, I get it, but it's not, right? And that's not the liberation step, that's just the next step, right? Yeah. So it's like the next step to stop these divisions in communities happening that are created both by ourselves and the fact that we're part of this system that designs for that. So that's my like shout out to all the philanthropists over there. Get going with it. Back to you, Danny.
Okay, so I'm going to go to another question that we got in, and this is from Edward, and it says, any suggestions for or comments about those that are working within the existing bureaucratic systems but agree with the perspective and ideas you are presenting?
I think most people do, they just can't say. It's not a safe space to be able to talk about any of this stuff that goes on within how decisions are made and how decisions are made. You know, you're starting to see it a lot more in America in terms of some of the literature that's been coming out recently in terms of revealing that, you know. But you got to remember, years and years ago, before I went into philanthropy, I used to deliver programs. I used to run various programs, and I didn't even know this world existed. I had no idea of whatever. All I knew is that every month someone, a faceless someone, would come around with a long ass form and say to me, yo, Derek, you were meant to work with 500 kids this month and you've worked with 498. What's happened to the last 2? Derek, you know, you're working with these young offenders, but you haven't filled out their criminal record form on 10 sheets of paper. Why hasn't this been done, even though you've been working with them for 2 weeks? Because it's not a good thing to be doing, you know. And so I only got into it largely because I was like, what is this world and who's making the decisions on the value of my work, given that the only thing that they could offer to me in those conversations was a tick box, you know. And my failure to meet that tick box resulting in me not getting much money. So you've got this whole system that is really comfortable, self-regulated, not very target driven. I'm talking about independent foundations here. I'm not talking about, you know, commissions and some of the public funding and stuff, where there isn't much incentive to really improve. There isn't much incentive to reveal any of this stuff. There really isn't much incentive to break the status quo, because it's just really, really comfortable. And that's not to say there's not people that are doing it. There's plenty of people within the system that's trying to, well, there are some people within the system that are trying to break it. But ultimately, while this isn't me advocating for self-regulation, for regulation or anything like that, I'm just saying that it really doesn't benefit those who would happily complain to me about being within it. Them actually speaking out about it, you know, and also there's plenty of people that are in it that feel that they can do good within it, you know. But it's really interesting, because the psyche of people within it, who in one respect, a lot of people I meet love doing the work because it enables them to touch and feel to some degree some level of social change and doing good. But there's also a huge level of melancholy in it, you know, because it is feeding a bureaucratic machine with lots of subjectivity, with people that don't understand. And that melancholy, which is felt, and this isn't just racialized, there's plenty of people that are within those systems that essentially feel melancholy because they're not out there doing the work, so getting that sort of instant gratification of doing the work. But at the same time, they're being this conduit between this elitist, privileged decision-making mechanism, and essentially just trying to game it as best for the thing. And that's not great for anyone's self-esteem. But, you know, as I said, the incentive to actually do anything about it is not really there.
Okay. I've got a few more questions for you. Thank you for that. So this one is from Deandra. Deandra asks, do you think it's worth it for people of colour to join boards of these trusts/foundations to create change from within? Or should POC seek to develop their own decolonised funding systems in order to influence equity of social change?
Both. You need the outside in and the inside out. So you need people that's within those structures that are able to move it, shift it, mobilize it, open the cracks in the door. But I also urge anyone that's within those systems to have a really good network of support to be able to do that. But you essentially need the innovation, you need the activism, you need all of the stuff that's going on the outside to create that alternative. You know, one of the things that happened for lots of the Black community in the 90s is, as we were striving, we had unbelievable independence in terms of not just charitable work, not just activism, but magazines, newspapers, alternative media at that particular point. And for me, you know, when I left uni, I didn't get a job through a formal interview until I was 29. So every time I would go for a job, I would just get rejected. The thing that saved me in my 20s, other than my parents being really patient and understanding, was the fact that I could work at somewhere like the Voice newspaper. I could work with an agency called Power Moves. I could work at various organizations, Black organizations, that could get me a CV, that could get me just on a step towards getting employment. That has been ripped away because so much of the work and that independent work has been co-opted, misappropriated, it's been absorbed into the mainstream, and you will have now white leaders leading that type of work, you know, and those and that has fundamentally squeezed that independence out. So for me, you need that independence on the outside. You need those platforms and those pathways, and you need people that can unfiltered, can really advocate for change. But you also need some of those champions on the inside to open the doors a little.
So it's almost about finding these places of balance, really, in kind of inside and outside. Okay, thank you. Right, so the last one is from Benjamin, who says, thank you both for sharing your wisdom and also challenging us all to do more. You mentioned some truly incredible and hopeful examples of Black and brown leaders such as Immy, Ruth, Fazana, and more. In the backdrop of so much pain and in danger of creating another list, what gives you hope today from within the funding community?
For me, I really enjoy my work with 30 Percy. I sit on their board. What I found was they listened when I was talking about this stuff. They conducted everything with unbelievable humility, gave me space, and that's right the way through the organization. It's a learning organization that has supported the resourcing racial justice and done that within, I mean, I joined the board probably less than a year ago, perhaps, and they're a young foundation. So in terms of funding, their behaviors and their relationship it's unbelievable that they've done that so quickly, given quite limited resource in comparison to other funders. So I always find it quite funny when so many funders say, we can't do this, we don't know how to do this, when they've been able to do it in a really short period of time. And coming back to Immy's point, right, so I come back to these 3 points of reconciliation, reparations, and reimagining. So reconciliation, which is where understanding where that money come from, putting a mirror up to yourself, and being able to look at giving as redistribution and not giving. Okay, reparations, which is saying for you to work that out, that will take time. So that 400 or 500 million that should be going into our communities should be going into our communities. So release 0.5%. If the top 100 or the top 10 endowed trust, independent endowed trust, release 1% or 0.5% of their money and put that into Black and brown communities, that will be a start. That's not a solution, but it's a start. And then the third bit is reimagination. And this is related to dismantling, is that fundamentally this system, if we're talking about dismantling policing, if we're talking about dismantling education, so it's not just about creating a new curriculum, which I absolutely agree with. It's also about getting rid of private schools. It's also about getting rid of Ofsted systems and all of that sort of stuff. Then philanthropy is part of that in terms of dismantling, but not just dismantling for the sake of dismantling. It's talking about reimagining, and reimagining a system where accountability is to communities and not to elitist boards. I go back to and I can't remember where I heard this from. There's this school up in I think in Kenya that has pupils, and it's based on a farm, and the pupils work with the teachers, and I think it's like 50% learning, 50% experiential learning as well. And then those young people, they sell local produce locally, and the money that's made from that goes to pay the teachers' wages. And I'm not saying that that's the most fantastic model or whatever. What I'm saying is that the layers of accountability are very different to one where you have a remote Ofsted inspector coming into the school, battering a teacher, for the teacher to then batter their kids just to be able to pass an exam to say that we are a good school, which is essentially what education is at this particular point. So if you're reimagining philanthropy in a way where that layer of accountability is more circular and doesn't look like how it is now, which is really top down. So even if you are a fantastic funder at this particular point, the bottom line is the decision-making processes are still top down. Yeah. So my bit in terms of hope is, who are the funders that are out there that are making this circular? And secondly, this isn't about being, it's not about participatory or participation, right? This is about ownership, and it's about communities owning this and people being accountable to communities. So it's not about being invited around the table, because if you're looking at it from a redistribution mindset, you're looking at about accountability looking differently. So to come back to the question, there is some hope in terms of people doing things differently. And I'm sure there's more examples out there in terms of funders. But as I said, the bit that says look, the mechanisms and means are out there for funders to actually fundamentally change and say, do you know what? We need to give up our power, which is another fundamental part of this, is giving up power. You actually have enough wealth and money to be able to do that. And again, just to Immy's point, I would love to see a report to see what the growth has been in endowments over the last 20 years. Because we know that most foundations give away probably under 5% or 4% of their money. Okay, so if that's the case, how much more could they have given away over the last 20 years based on the growth of their endowments? Okay, because I would also say that is a case to turn around and say that's a huge amount of money that we haven't been able to access.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Derek, and thanks for hosting that, Zaz. That's been really great. And Derek, I want to kind of invite you to just have a moment to think about what you're going to leave your closing thoughts as. And when as I'm just talking about, just wrapping that up while you have a think, I think in that bit about like what gives me hope, I think, yeah, there is, it's really true. Of 30 Percy, for example, and the humanity and trust and humility and honesty and relationship in which they have built is just been like really exemplary. And you know, there's been loads and loads of good examples within that. For me, talking about the system of philanthropy, its history, and dismantling it is nothing to do with attacking good individuals within the system who haven't been trying to do everything they can to move resource, right? But like 10 good people in a system that who are working really hard to try and get money to projects is not going to unravel like many centuries of like of extraction and violence and lack of transparency, for example, about things like Derek just said, the growth of the endowment, whilst where did that growth come from? So what were they investing in to get that much growth? Because nothing that's super just can grow that quickly. And we've learned that all day around like mycelium networks and how growth can't just be this endless upwards curve. So something doesn't really make sense. Well, we know, but it doesn't make sense for them to grow that much without there being investment in stuff that has exploited, right? And then if you have got investment from stuff that's exploited, why isn't the massive growth and or at least a significant percentage of that going into where you extracted that from in the first place or historically? And so I think another thing that before Derek wraps up that's really troubling for me is like lots of people are asking for these lists, but like the reimagination and the projects out there that are like organizing, like Derek mentions, incredible projects up north by Roof, or the land reparations, land justice work that Amara Spence and others have been doing for so long. Like these things are out there, right? Instead of coming to people like me and not just me, because I've only had, I make it sound like everybody's on my door for lists, but they're really not. I just had a couple. But like instead of coming to people like me and Derek, just get to know the projects, right? I don't freaking understand why those crowdfunders that I keep talking about every damn day on this festival, right, aren't just at 100, 200, 500,000 pounds, because I know you've got the money and I know that's just a tiny little bit in your back pocket. So, and I can see loads of people in this chat from funders, right? Like stop listening to this and just at least go and fund those 6 projects. So we know that you're serious about it. And I don't mean getting it to the small bit that they've asked for. I'm talking about smashing that out the park, getting it to 250,000, 500,000, 1 million, so that people can start organizing. So I'm just like not here for you guys just coming to Reimagining Philanthropy talks and then not going and doing something with the big money that you have and you know you have. And then I want to add to that before Derek finishes off and say that this idea of accountability of these crowdfunders. Okay, right. I really want to say something about this because a lot of funders have said to me, oh no, we can't put money straight into that because we don't know what's happening with it. And how do we know what's going to happen with the money, etc., etc. I can guarantee you every penny of the money that goes into those crowdfunders, even if one of those organizers takes 6 months off and sits in a flipping spa just to get over the trauma of what's been going on in the last few years, particularly, but over the whole lifetimes, right? even that would be a good investment. But let me tell you, every penny that goes into those organisers that are in community with each other and who are doing such important work, and you know how much we are pitted against each other and how we end up making mistakes because we think the competition is each other, but it's not. Don't talk about accountability of that money when that money is going to spread, it's going to do important work. It's a tiny, tiny dip in the amount of resource that's required to dismantle and do that reparation work. And of course, you will get transparency, you will get results and outcomes, but don't start with that, because if you want to start with that, then tomorrow you need to unravel and show us how much your endowments have grown and show how much of that you've used, where that money came from, and then we can talk about accountability. So I just needed to say this because there is so much money out there and so many ideas. Stop asking for lists, stop listening to us. These panels and these chats are lovely, but get out there and start moving money. And to those of you at high five, to those of you who feel uncomfortable for this, it's not an attack on you, okay? This is a system that you're struggling through as well. Just go spend some money, invest in those projects, invest in visions. And on that note, Derek, who's far more able to not just shout at the screen and give us good advice and is an elder that we should all be looking up to, is going to give you the closing words, which hopefully won't just be screaming into the laptop, which I've just done. Thank you for indulging me in that. Over to Derek for the final words.
That wasn't screaming. I completely agree. And ultimately, where you know that you've sent so many lists is when the lists pop back to you and you realize stuff that you've written have popped back into someone else's list. And that's what's happened recently. The lists are circulating and there are plenty of organizations on the list, but it's not an exhaustive list. And I don't know everyone that's on that list, but I agree with Immy in the sense of invest, put your money in, trust, because these are all good organizations doing good work. And this is a moment to step out of the way and let them do good work. But we're talking about long-term sustained reparative grant making that needs to happen here. Just in terms of closing, and I come back to dancehall music, and I come back to dancehall music because, ultimately, when you look at the roots of that in Jamaica, which had nothing, no equipment, no, not much resource, it created a music that for me is pop music. Pop music should be dancehall music because all of the ingredients in dancehall music is pop, and it should be what is the standard in pop. And we've seen it in little bits and dribs and drabs from Rihanna and from Drake. But for me, it's the pop music. But the reason I come back to dancehall music is its roots and the fact that they were able to take one tune, one rhythm track, and make all 10 or 15 excellent tunes from one rhythm track. They're able to do it on minimal studios, artists coming in and doing it on one take because they didn't have enough resource to be able to have any more studio time to do it. And then those ideas of those artists was cultivated by producers, and the producers became the shop owners. They became the distributors. They became the licensees. They became the people that spread it. And they were able to spread it and spread it well, largely because they were in it. And they were in that world that was creating this magical piece of music. So for me, I always come back to the dancehall analogy in that this is this incredible music, this music that should be the pop music of today. But the roots of it come from something where I see so much of this in various communities here and abroad, where the ideas are selected from those within those communities because they get it, they understand it. So ways in which money cultivates these pieces of work to enable us to have our dancehall producers in our different communities being resourced to be able to spread their work. That's the way we need to go.
Thanks so much, Derek. Thank you, Zaz, for jumping in. I'll unmute you both in a sec so you can say by yourselves. But can I just say, Derek, thanks for your honesty. Thanks for the conversations we all have. And I know it's not just me with you. where you're honest about your own journey, you're honest about what your generation has been able to do, what it's struggled with, and you're constant championing in the background and doing that like messy work of trying to find your way through a current system. I know that you're the person that I go to quite often just to go, oh shit, it's gone wrong again. I thought we dealt with this challenge, but now I've messed up here. What do we do with this? And you know, you're always showing what's on the horizon, what to be aware of. So I just want to say thanks and huge gratitude to you, not just from me, but on behalf of all the people that I know that you're that for. I'm going to finish off by saying Derek's got a great book. Buy his book. Buy it from an independent bookshop. He's got some great articles out today or yesterday in The Guardian. Derek's everywhere and he's just a legend. And I just want to say thank you, and I'll meet you both now as well.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.